So how can we promote cultural participation for everyone? And what does this even mean? And so this is the third of these 7 topics that I kind of thought, well, these are what I think are the main ways that museums can support sustainable development. And they're set out in that guide there, which you can get for free from the link. And then we'll be exploring the other topics in later webinars, and then looking at how to put them all together in the last of the series of 7. So what we'll look at is how cultural participation relates to people's rights, to look at how can museums provide effective services for all of society, and how can we use the Sustainable Development Goals and targets to help us plan and deliver that work. And so this is based on, it also draws on 2 of these other guides that I did. The one on museums and disaster risk reduction, which is a slightly scary title for building resilience, and the other one on museums and human rights, which really looks at the rights that each of us have, that all of us have, but also the responsibilities that institutions such as museums have to support people with their rights. And as we see with COVID, or with climate change, or with very many other issues, not everyone experiences them in the same ways. There are many groups who are disadvantaged for various reasons, and they actually feel the effects worse. And we can see that very clearly with COVID, that those who are less resilient, they suffer most. And that's why we have to do something, and partly why we have to do something about it. So cultural participation is based on this idea. It's based on the idea of equality of everyone, and it's based on non-discrimination. And it comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here we have Eleanor Roosevelt holding the Declaration for Human Rights. And if we can remember where it came from, it was produced after the absolute horrors of the Second World War, to try to make sure that people never had to go through such horror again. And I've just picked out 2 of the rights. There are 30 rights. That all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights is a beautiful, beautiful idea. And the last one is that no one can take your human rights away from you. No one has the right to do that. And so why am I talking so much about human rights? Well, in a increasingly polarized or fractured or problematic difficulties that we see in society, this is a quote from John Ruggie, was an advisor to the United Nations, that whatever other differences may exist in the world, starting with the 1948 Universal Declaration, human rights are the only internationally agreed expression of the entitlements that each and every one of us has, simply because we're human beings. That's not to say that we're all the same, because of course we're not, but we are all human. We do all have this certain set of basic rights. And so the right to culture so the right to participate in cultural life is one of the human rights contained in the Universal Declaration. And the right to culture has been, talked about many times, and UNESCO they put it very well, that they say that the cultural rights, the cultural rights we each have are, to know and to understand and to visit and to make use of, maintain, exchange and develop cultural heritage and cultural expressions, as well as to be able to access to understand the cultural heritage and cultural expressions of others. It's a bit of a long sentence. So as I mentioned, the right to participate in cultural life is included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's like, well, what does that mean to participate in cultural life? And it's regarded as being made up of 3 things. The right to participate in cultural life, that everyone has the right to take part in cultural activities. The right of everyone to know and to understand their own culture and that of others through education and information. And everyone has the right to contribute to cultural life, to be involved in creating the spiritual, material, intellectual and emotional expressions of the community. And I love this idea because it's it's worded slightly differently from saying a right to culture, because then that's like, well, what is culture? It makes culture a kind of object. This is saying that everyone has the right to participate in cultural life, that culture as being part of their life, their existence, whether it takes part in a museum, in a shop, in a football field, in the town, in the park, anywhere. It's the extent to which culture is part of our life. And it's a really nice idea, I think, because then museums can ask, how are they supporting people's cultural life? It's not, as Elena said, it's not just about saying, oh, the doors are open, come on in. That's not enough. And in fact is kind of the wrong way around. It's about the difference that we make in the world, to people's lives in the world. And this is seen up as being made of, well, the right to access cultural life is made up of kind of 5 elements. There needs to be an availability, there need to be sites and cultural institutions such as museums. They need to be accessible so that people can seek information. They need to be acceptable to the individuals and communities involved, so meeting their particular needs. Things that are developing activities that are of interest and are relevant to their lives. They need to be adaptable, they need to be able to change, as society changes, and they need to be appropriate. So they need to acknowledge that not everyone experiences cultural activities in the same ways, so they need to be respectful of cultural differences and any minorities involved, so that they can access the services. You find this 4 or 5 A's model you find very often with what are called human rights-based approaches. But the right to culture is under attack in lots of ways, and accessing and enjoying culture is an important part of being a citizen, a member of a community, and more widely, a member of society. So at a time when artists, cultural minorities, cultural heritage and cultural expressions are increasingly under attack, defending the cultural rights of individuals and communities has never been more important. And this is from an initiative that UNESCO runs called the Right to Culture, and the link is there. So we see the right to culture threatened by intolerance of minorities. We see that all over the place. Artistic and curatorial expression and freedom of speech under attack in some countries, not perhaps in all countries. And also the rise of violent extremism. And we can see violent extremism not just in a very large scale, but just in the kind of day-to-day intolerance, the kind of roughening of debate that there is, partly through social media and so on, fake news and these kind of things. So yeah, so the right to culture additionally threatened by the inequality that there is within and between countries, the funding crisis that will certainly arise from the COVID-19 pandemic, the abuse of information and post-truth and misinformation, so to deliberately mislead people, the large-scale movement of people that alienates them from their own culture and heritage and enlarges minorities, and generally just the poor understanding of culture and what it is, and heritage and their value. But it's important to say that cultural rights don't exist in a box, they don't exist in a bubble, that we all have economic, social and cultural rights, and they're very closely tied up with our civil and political rights. And really, it's a bit misleading to talk about, this group or this group or this group of rights, because all rights are of equal importance and they can't be picked apart. And it's very important to always remember that rights can't be used to deny someone else their rights. It's supposed to be a negotiation for all of society together. So museums, of course, aren't only related to people's cultural rights. They employ lots of people, so they're associated with employment rights. People have a right of access to information. We need to look at equal treatment of men, women and minorities. We need to look at fair treatment of parents and families. We need to ensure that everyone has equal access to public services, which doesn't mean the same access. And we also need to acknowledge that cultural groups should be represented in a positive and constructive way, which they aren't always. And so if we look at the list of people who are likely to be excluded, marginalised or underserved, we can use those three terms kind of interchangeably. Women and girls, older people, ethnic minorities and cultural groups, LGBT people, poor people, migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, people with mental or physical illness, or people with disabilities, or people who have been imprisoned. And actually, when you were to look at, to tot up, well, how many people are in each of these groups, there's not that much of society left. So people, many parts of society are at risk of being underserved by public services, such as museums. And so in order to try to address these challenges, there have been lots of human rights conventions that have been developed that countries all agreed to. Latvia would have agreed to some or all of these. And if we look at the age of some of these, it is quite shocking that, you know, if we have the Human Rights Convention Against Racial Discrimination, it's from 1965, it's you know, 60 plus years old. Conventions against discrimination against women, against torture, you know, to protect children's rights, to protect migrant workers and their families, to end the trafficking of people, against forced disappearance, the rights of disabled people. And the last one at the bottom here is to do with LGBT people who shouldn't need a separate set of rights because their rights are already guaranteed in all conventions. But unfortunately, as we know, many groups of these continue to be discriminated against. So these conventions, in a way, haven't worked. And in addition to the conventions, which have a legal standing, there are declarations which are internationally agreed, but they are voluntary. So there's one on the independence of colonial countries and peoples and decolonization, and the right to development, that everyone has the right to live, you know, to expect society to develop in positive ways, rights of indigenous peoples, and the rights of farmers and people working in rural areas. But we have to acknowledge that culture and heritage are not just nice things. They can be used in very negative ways. Particularly like claims of tradition can be used to justify lots of forms of intolerance and abuse and injustice, and that is simply not acceptable. So we have to challenge these claims wherever possible. And so Farida Shahid was the United Nations Special Reporter on Cultural Rights. And she said in 2011 that, this is a good definition, I think, that cultural heritage is to be understood as resources that enable the cultural identification and development processes of individuals and communities, which they implicitly or explicitly wish to transmit to future generations. A few more quotes from her. And in 2013, she said that in relation to the teaching of history, that historical narratives are important elements of cultural heritage. They play a decisive role in collective identity. How we learn and what we know about our past can either strengthen peace and respect for the human rights of all, or maintain division and tensions among different groups of society. And she recommended that, well, what can we do in this situation? So she recommended that history should include a ratio of local, national, regional, and global history. It should ensure that a wide range of textbooks are used. It should raise awareness about how history is manipulated in textbooks, and I would also say in museums. And to ensure the continuous education and professional development of history teachers, and we could also include museum educators and curators in this, who are pivotal in promoting a human rights perspective. And in relation to memorials, which we'll come to talk about later, because memorials can become a kind of flashpoint or a focus for differences between groups. So she recommended to ask, well, what are the specific intended goals of the memorial? Who is it made for, and what will be its likely social impact? Who participates in its establishment, and does it include a plurality of narratives? Does it include many different sides of a story? And collaboration between authorities, citizen and civil society is an essential element of successful memorialization, commemoration. And so she recommended memorialization processes should help contribute to overcoming denial that fuels hatred, resentment, and violence of the horrors of the past, recognizing the victims of oppression, looking for reconciliation between groups that were opposed during conflicts, preventing intolerance, hate crime, and human rights abuses through education, awareness, and participatory programs, and redefining national identity by a policy of pluralism that acknowledges different communities and recognises past and present human rights abuses. And really, the last one is extremely important, promoting critical thinking and dialogue on the representation of the past, as well as contemporary challenges. And so one of the sites that she talks about as being important in this are museums, because she talks about the importance of public spaces to support people's rights to take part in cultural life and public affairs. So public places are places where various, sometimes opposing worldviews can at times be expressed and where controversies can be debated in circumstances that respect the human rights of all. It's necessary to preserve existing public spaces as well as to create new ones for people to learn, develop their creativity and experience the humanity of others and to foster civic engagement. Such actions are necessary to combat rising tensions within and between countries, for example, nationalism, fundamentalism and extremism, intolerance of minorities and hate speech. And just the last one I'll talk about here are that people also have environmental rights. So people have a right to access environmental information and they have a right to participate in environmental decision making. So I've talked a lot about the rights that people have, but then we can talk about, well, how are those rights being met? That's what I'll talk about next. So what can museums do? Well, these are just a list of very simple lists that they could teach on cultural and ethnic diversity. They can teach on historic and contemporary intolerance. They can combat prejudice and stereotypes of all kinds in educational programs. And we don't need to just talk about challenges all the time, just create shared experiences that focus on what unites people rather than what divides them. And so some of this just comes to questions, you know, it's like if we think less about the past, we'll talk about the present and the future. What kind of place do we want to live in and what kind of world, what kind of community do we want to live in? And as I mentioned, create these opportunities for people from different backgrounds to create their visions of the future and to create those visions together. And so I've got some great quotes because I love quotes. So in terms of the role of museums in these kind of challenges, so this is a brilliant quote from Desmond Tutu. If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. I've got another one from him. That there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And this relates to Elena's point that we, as I say, we can't just have the doors open and expect everyone to use museums. We need to reach out to those who are left behind to help them, you know, to help invite them in and to help provide services for them. And this is one from Kofi Annan, that none of us is born to hate, that intolerance is taught and it can be untaught. And really the way that I personally think that the way that fear and mistrust grow is when people don't have experience of other groups. So how we help people come in contact with people different from themselves is one of the best ways to combat intolerance. And so this was from the Constitution of UNESCO, that since wars begin in the minds of men and women, because this is quite an old comment, it is in the minds of men and women that the defences of peace must be constructed. That's surely what we should be doing in museums. And so, as I mentioned, there have been lots of conventions over the years, and I think I would hope you'd see from the list that I went through earlier, there are lots that are relevant to museums, but museums just aren't aware of them because they exist in a kind of quite formal diplomatic structure and language, and it can be difficult to know, well, which of these agendas should I be following? And so I've spoken over this series of webinars are about how museums can use the Sustainable Development Goals, which come from this document, Agenda 2030, Transforming Our World, which is supposed to be a kind of blueprint for all sectors to use to try to make the world a better place and get us on a path to a sustainable future by 2030. And one of the reasons why there's such a fantastic agenda is that all of these existing commitments, all of the human rights conventions, environmental conventions, are already wrapped up into these 17 goals and the 169 targets that go with them. And so if we look at, I don't expect you to take in all of this, but these are a set of thematic indicators that UNESCO put together for how culture contributes to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And just to say that of the four kind of categories here, one quarter of them are around inclusion and participation. And so just to go through quite quickly, well, what are the overall aims of transforming our world, Agenda 2030 and the SDGs? So I'll just go through these. So they have this thing called 5 Ps, which is the quite easy way to remember what the top kind of aims are. To end poverty and hunger in all their forms and dimensions, and to ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and in a healthy environment. And poverty doesn't just mean access to money, although that's part of it. It also means access to your culture and heritage, and to participate in decision making. Prosperity is to ensure that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives, and that economic, social and technological progress occurs in harmony with nature. And peace is of course extremely important, that we're determined to foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies, free from fear and violence. There can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. Excuse me. And then the last one is partnership. So to mobilize the means required to implement this agenda, based on a spirit of strengthened global solidarity, focused in particular on the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable, and with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all people. And so one of the amazing things with Agenda 2030 is it's not just for governments, it's an invitation to all of society. And so where it says all stakeholders there in the last sentence, I read that to mean all sectors, including museums. And so it has these principles of, there's the principle of leave no one behind. And there's also of start with the farthest behind first, help those who are most seriously left behind. And so it can help us to ask, well, who is left behind in our community? And to ask again, well, what are you doing to address it? And why is it tolerated? So what I would say is that all museums can support a culture of peace, of non-violence, of tolerance and mutual understanding of different communities and groups. And if they don't, they're actually part of the problem. They only sustain the division and suspicion. We need to shift that. We just need to change it. And so if we look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they relate in very many ways to cultural participation. I've got that on the next slide. And I've just picked out some examples that we might think of in relation to museums. So target 1B, it sits in the goal about zero poverty. So create pro-poor and gender-sensitive policy frameworks. What does that mean for museums? Well, are museums concerned with addressing poverty in their area? What can they do about it? Target 3, what one is it? 3, 4, I think, there, is reduce mortality from non-communicable diseases and to promote mental health. So again, what are museums doing to address this? 5.1 is around ending discrimination against women and girls. 8, just this thing is in my way here. 8.7 is around ending modern slavery, trafficking and child labour. I think, well, what's modern slavery got to do with museums or got to do with me? Even as if I was to go to my kitchen cupboard, just to make it up now, if I was to go to my kitchen cupboard, can I be confident that the products that I'm using in my life weren't produced by people who were being exploited or even in modern slavery conditions? What can museums do to help people understand that? Are museums also committed to ensuring that they aren't involved in modern slavery through, for instance, cleaning services or kitchen services? Or waste disposal services? If they have restaurants, do they sell fish? Who's producing the fish? These are all industries. These are all business, parts of the economy that have terrible modern slavery concerns in them. Target 8.8 about promoting labour rights. Of course, museums employ lots of people in promoting safe working environments. And then arguably the most important single target for cultural participation for all is this one around target 10.2, promoting everyone's social, economic and political inclusion is a very good one to start with. 10.3 is around what are we doing to reduce inequalities. 11.7 is around providing safe and welcoming green and public spaces. And although the little picture there looks very much like it's all outside, well, of course, museums are public spaces, as we saw earlier in what I was saying from the Special Rapporteur. Target 16.6 is around providing effective, transparent institutions. And effective would mean that they meet the needs of all of society and they fulfill their rights obligations, which are contained in 16.10 there. Here we go. But this all basically comes down to one simple thing. It comes down to justice. It comes down to acknowledging that, well, people have different needs, different capacities, different aspirations, but they all have a right to access culture. We spoke about that earlier on. And so this is very, very, very fundamental to me, I think. And then the more that institutions fulfill their basic obligations, that's actually how those institutions are stronger. They're more robust, they're more resilient, more effective. And so just a few targets to pick up. I know this one is really long. We spoke about this in the last webinar. It's about education for sustainable development and global citizenship is a whole style of learning. There's lots of resources that go with it. And it's about ensuring all learners acquire the knowledge and skills for sustainable development. And I'll not go through it all, but including human rights, gender equality, promoting a culture of peace and non-violence. 4.5 is to eliminate gender disparities in education, ensure equal access to all levels of education including for people with disabilities, Indigenous people and children in vulnerable situations. What does this mean? It means basically just provide educational and training programs that invite these people in, you know, that meet their needs. So if we take some particular examples in Latvia, as I understand it, you have debate over what constitutes a family, associated with a lot of homophobia, mistrust between Latvian and Russian-speaking communities, and a bit of a concern about racism and intolerance of ethnic minorities. And as I mentioned before, like LGBT people, they face particular challenges in society. Excuse me. A lack of access to justice, abuse and violence. They're often discriminated against in work. And Stonewall have produced a really excellent guide there for how they are particularly impacted in relation to each of the 17 SDGs. And in a similar way, disabled people face particular challenges, and their disabilities specifically mentioned in targets for a number of SDGs around education, work, social inclusion, sustainable communities, and partnerships for the goals. And UN DESA has developed a specific guide on disability and development, which is a really nice one because it's titled Realising the Sustainable Development Goals by, for and with persons with disabilities. And then if we take these Latvian examples, so this is a poster from one of the campaigns, that we can be excluded from the constitution, but we can't be excluded from society. And in some ways we can think that what may be in the law is not necessarily entirely consistent with people's rights. And so, of course, museums have to uphold the law, but they can also help people explore rights more broadly. And if we just take a few examples, so this is the Janice Lipkin Memorial Museum, which to me is a story of two things. It's a story of the awful intolerance that can result from that is the kind of the end result of fear, mistrust becomes hatred, intolerance. But on the other hand, the museum is also a memorial to an extremely brave man and how he stood up for the rights of others. And that relates very well to these sustainable development goals that I've mentioned here, around no poverty. As I mentioned, is not just about access to money, but is about basically about having access to your life. Good health and well-being, you know, people who were terribly discriminated against, quality education, because we're educating people for tolerance and promotion of justice, reducing inequalities, looking at sustainable cities and communities where people who are from different groups live together in harmony, and peace, justice and strong institutions. So this is a museum that is making I would say, making a real difference because it addresses a situation of great concern. And of course, it supports peace and justice. This was a discussion on Caspar Erbe and his diaries at the he was gay, and and so his life story and his diaries are used as an opportunity for people to talk about their own experience of LGBT issues in different ways. And we see this basically the same set of challenges in terms of the SDGs that there were when I spoke previously about the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And then this was an exhibition from the story of Latvia's centenary in 2018. And so we have here the life stories of people from a range of different ethnic groups, cultural groups, of their life. What was their experience in Latvia? So we have a Russian, actually I won't get some, I've not written down that caption correctly. But we can see a Polish Russian, Olga, Valdis, and Renata. And then this was a really nice exhibition at the Maduana Local History and Art Museum in 2020, and it's by a Canadian artist called Diane Hiscox. What do we value? And it's about homeless people. And what do we value? Do we value people, or do we value things? Do we value precious materials like gold, which is shown on the artworks here? And she makes these artworks are very small and very kind of precious. And it's to act, well, what is the most precious thing? And are all human lives of the same value? And then a particularly contentious issue is around a memorial. As I mentioned before, memorials can become a kind of focus for the tensions that exist more broadly. The celebration of the Soviet Army's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II in the Riga Victory Park. Also the start of Soviet occupation of Latvia. So here we have two extremely different interpretations of the same event. So that's not so much to do with inequality, it's to do with different perspectives. That's why I mentioned these two sustainable development goals here. So how can we have a sustainable cities and communities where there are such different interpretations of what happened in the past? So one of the ways we might do that is to focus on, well, what are the other opportunities through the year that are to do with collaboration, partnership, peace, justice, the future. And these are just a few examples that I've taken from a list of international, they're called International Observance Days. And just to pick out a few here, for example, almost at the bottom of the list, there are two around the International Day of Families and the Global Day of Parents. So museums could celebrate those days. Just to give an example, museums could celebrate those days and talk about how families exist in many, many different forms. And families have existed in many different forms forever. So to try to, show that families have always existed in different forms. And so just to mention some resources that can help you in this work. The first two are also talked about in the last webinar that I did about education for sustainable development and global citizenship education. And then the OHCHR is the website of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And they have excellent resources to explore human rights issues. And of course, you can look at the Sustainable Development Goals website with lots of information and resources to help each of the SDGs. Thank you.